Check, check. Audio check from the hearing room. 1, 2, 3.
Committee will come to order. Today we are joined by the chairs of the Strategic Posture Review Commission. The FY22 NDAA established the commission to assess the long-term strategic posture of the United States and to provide Congress with recommendations to improve our nuclear deterrent. We did this because for the first time since the dawn of the atomic era, the United States must deter two nuclear peer adversaries simultaneously. China is rapidly expanding its nuclear forces in what Admiral Richard, the former STRATCOM commander, described as a breathtaking strategic breakout. According to the Department of Defense's most recent report on China's military power, the pace of its rapid nuclear buildup will only accelerate in the coming years. Meanwhile, Russia possesses the largest and most diverse nuclear arsenal in the world. It maintains a nuclear weapons production complex capable of producing hundreds of warheads per year, and its arsenal continues to expand. Most alarming, its stockpile of non-strategic nuclear weapons, a category of nuclear arms not limited by any treaty, reportedly holds at least a 10-to-1 advantage over the U.S. Both China and Russia are also developing new, highly destabilizing nuclear capabilities designed to avoid U.S. early warning systems and give both nations the ability to launch surprise nuclear attacks. China is also developing a fractional orbital bombardment system armed with nuclear hypersonic glide body. And Russia is on the cusp of fielding a suite of new capabilities, including a nuclear-armed cruise missiles powered by nuclear reactors and a megaton-class long-range underwater nuclear system. Meanwhile, North Korea's nuclear arsenal is rapidly expanding and growing in sophistication, and Iran is within a few days from having enough enriched uranium to build a bomb. The United States, on the other hand, has allowed its nuclear enterprise to wither away. As of today, we cannot produce a nuclear weapon. We are the only nuclear power unable to do so. Years of complacency have caused significant delays in our efforts to resolve this capability. And while I was pleased to see the successful first flight of the B-21 this weekend, programs to build modern replacements for our Cold War-era nuclear triad have suffered from repeated delays. And finally, the Biden administration's efforts to end development of a nuclear-capable sea-launched cruise missile and retire other nuclear weapons before their replacements arrive further undermines our strategic deterrent. We need to reverse course. We need an enhanced level of innovation and investment in our nuclear modernization. That's what this commission on a bipartisan basis is asking us to do. As the commission notes, maintaining a credible strategic deterrent will be expensive, but failing to do so will result in a war that is far more expensive in both lives and resources. I applaud the commission for their great work, and I strongly support their recommendations. I look forward to working with my colleagues on ways to implement them. And with that, I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask for unanimous consent for Ranking Member Smith's opening statement to be entered into the record.
Without objection.
As the Chairman said, we clearly have a lot of work to do and not a lot of time to do it. And that means we need to move quickly, but it also means we need to be wise. We need to be smart about the investments that we make. I want to highlight some of the points in Ranking Member Smith's statement before we hear from our witnesses. I have often said that the world would be safer without nuclear weapons, and we should all continue to strive for that someday. But we also need to be realistic. As we face today's more challenging strategic environment, we must ensure that our nuclear deterrent is safe, secure, and reliable. And as we do that, we'll need to ensure that any changes to our nuclear force posture don't draw us into a massive nuclear arms race. As the ranking member's statement acknowledges, maintaining strategic deterrence in such a complex threat environment requires a whole-of-government approach. The Department of Defense alone cannot be successful at deterring or prevailing in strategic conflict without leveraging our diplomatic and economic tools. His statement also highlights the fact that the report does not call for any immediate changes to our nuclear deterrent. I agree that the DoD should focus on increasing conventional capabilities, a strong recommendation of the report, with a particular emphasis on innovation in the defense industrial base and improving resilience across our existing space and nuclear command and control architectures. Lastly, I want to associate myself with the ranking member's comments regarding the lack of prioritization or costs associated with the recommendations. It makes it difficult for us to determine how to move forward without those, and lends itself to those who say we should just do everything everywhere all at once. That, of course, is not possible, but it also could be dangerous. So we've got to be wise about how we move forward, but we also have a lot of work to do. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank Mr. Moulton. Now I'd like to introduce our witnesses. The Honorable Madeline Creedon is the chair of the commission. She's the former Principal Deputy Administrator of NNSA and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs. And of course, we have the Honorable John Kyle, who's the commission's vice chair. He spent 26 years representing Arizona in the U.S. House and Senate and remains a tremendous leader on national security issues. Welcome. And Ms. Creedon, we'll start with you. You're recognized.
Thank you very much. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, Congressman Moulton, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning on the report of the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States. Senator Kyle, the Vice Chair of the Commission, and I are pleased to appear here today to discuss the Commission's bipartisan consensus report. Our report and the 81 recommendations contained therein is consistent with our statutory charge, which was to conduct a review of the strategic posture of the United States, including a strategic threat assessment and a detailed review of nuclear weapons policy, strategy, and force structure, and factors affecting the strategic stability of new peer competitors of the United States and peer and near-peer nuclear power competition. Although the report is hard-hitting, it is also fairly subtle and requires a careful reading. This subtlety has led to some confusion about what the report does and does not recommend. We are not recommending substantial increases in the U.S. nuclear force posture. We want to avoid a new nuclear arms race, and most importantly, we want to avoid a nuclear conflict, and thus we need a credible conventional and nuclear deterrent. We do recommend that we plan and be prepared for a more challenging future while fully supporting diplomatic and whole-of-government operations to reduce tensions and ensure strategic stability. The Commission's report is threat-informed, forward-looking, bipartisan consensus. The report provides high-level guidance to shape and ensure future decision-makers have real options while generally refraining from choosing specific systems. We provide characteristics of recommended capabilities, but do not pick the winners and losers. The time frame for the report is 2027 and beyond, looking at least to 2035. The Commission concluded that U.S. defense strategy and posture must change to properly defend its vital interests and improve strategic stability with Russia and China. Given the current threat trajectories, in the coming years, the U.S. will face a world with two nations that possess nuclear weapons, nuclear arsenals on par with our own. Facing, deterring two nuclear weapons is unprecedented. I would also note that this is the second Nuclear Posture Commission. The first one issued its report in 2009 and hoped for a much better world. To quote, they said they rejected the vision of a world defined over the next decade or two by a renewal of competition for nuclear advantage among the major powers. Unfortunately, that's not the path the world chose to go down. Today, the U.S. is on the cusp of a fundamentally different global setting that we did not want and for which we did not plan and are not well prepared. Our commission was very focused on being prepared and laying the foundation now for decisions that might be needed in the future. We want to ensure that decision makers can make decisions and that they actually have options to implement. As prospects for agreements on nuclear arms control now appear bleak, we must consider that we may be in a situation where there is no strategic arms control treaty. That said, diplomacy must be strengthened as there is no reason to stop pursuing broader risk reduction efforts when achievable and in the U.S. national security interest. If there are opportunities for arms control or other strategic stability talks, military-to-military talks, confidence-building measures, or other opportunities, they should all be explored. There are 5 assumptions that underpin our report. First, Russia and China will continue their respective adversarial paths, each growing the quality and quantity of their nuclear arsenals. China will continue to grow its conventional forces, including its space and cyber capabilities. Russia will grow its space and cyber capabilities, and each will continue their aggressive foreign policies and seek to supplement the U.S. global leadership role. Second, today's one major war strategy construct is no longer viable, particularly given China's current trajectory. The 6 foundational longstanding tenets of U.S. nuclear strategy remain valid. 4, strong allies and partners are essential and make us all stronger together, but we need greater cooperation, coordination, and integration. The U.S. deterrent must be credible and seen that way by our adversaries as well as our allies and partners. From a force structure perspective, the U.S. nuclear modernization program of record must be fully implemented as rapidly as possible to deter Russia and China. The program of record is necessary but not sufficient to address the projected threat. And finally, I would like to highlight the report's reduction on infrastructure and the industrial base, both at DoD and the National Security Administration, which are out of date, unusable, and in some cases literally falling down. Both departments are struggling with supply chain issues, and neither have enough capacity to meet future requirements on a timely basis. So we need investment in the DoD and NNSA infrastructure. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Creedon. Senator Kyle, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you and the ranking member for setting the stage with opening statements that really highlight the fact that we are entering into an unprecedented time when for the first time the United States faces potential adversaries, both of whom would be nuclear peers with the United States. And that really was the beginning of our understanding of what we needed to recommend to the Commission. I'd like to reiterate a point that Madeline made, that this was a consensus report. All 12 commissioners signed this document. And since you are aware that the commissioners were appointed by the leadership of the House and Senate and the Armed Services Committees, you can appreciate the fact that we started out as a rather disparate group of people with differing points of view. The reason I mention that is that knowing the commissioners and knowing that we provided a document that is a consensus, unanimous document, should give you some confidence that we would not be recommending that the United States start a new arms race. That is not something this commission would do, as Madeline said. What are the facts? I'm a little sensitive to that critique because it reveals to me that a misunderstanding of the facts that exist today. After the Cold War, the United States allowed our nuclear enterprise to atrophy, both the weapons and the delivery systems. Not long after that, Russia began a program of modernizing its forces, as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, to the point that today Russia is about 90% through its program of modernization and has resulted in a wide array of both weapons and delivery systems. In the meantime, China decided to build up its military in a way unseen since the Cold War. And it is quite a ways down the road toward achieving its goal, which is parity with the United States and Russia, especially with regard to the nuclear forces. And where is the United States in the meantime? Well, we're out of the starting blocks, but as you pointed out, we're going to have a very difficult time even meeting the goals that we've set forward to try to achieve our existing program of record by the year 2035. We will be fortunate if we can do that. So that's where we are. We're obviously not starting anything. We're playing catch-up, and it's going to be a pretty tough job to catch up. The other thing that I'll mention relates to a point that Representative Moulton made. Your remit to our commission was not to develop a cost analysis, and we did not do that, as you point out. I think it would have been too difficult to do in any event because much of what needs to be done in the future has yet to be decided. The Commission can see very clearly what kind of requirements we need to meet, what kind of capabilities we need to have, but precisely what weapon systems comprise that suite will remain to be seen, and therefore it's very difficult to put a cost to it. But I would make this point. When Representative Moulton, you say we may need to set some priorities within the overall budget, I would push back on that with this foundation. Every recent Secretary of Defense and Joint Chiefs Chairman has said that the strategic posture, the strategic deterrent, and in particular our nuclear deterrent, is the #1 priority of the Defense Department. And if that's the case, then we have to act like it's the #1 priority. That means that when you set priorities, this has the top priority. And we shouldn't be fighting within the deterrent program, our strategic deterrent program, for the dollars that are needed to achieve the deterrent that we need. What are we all about here? We're trying to prevent war. What is more important to the American people than deterring a would-be opponent from being tempted to think that they could attack the United States in some way and be better off for it? Our deterrent must persuade them that that cannot be. So in mentioning this consensus report, I hope that there is some acknowledgement that these 12 very different people up here would not be recommending something foolish. We put a lot of thought into this. And the specifics with regard to various weapon systems in the future, as Madeline said, will have to be deferred until the people at the Defense Department, our R&D programs and others decide what the best way to satisfy the requirements is. Our job was to set forth the requirements. Final point. We recommend that the leadership of the Congress and the administration must take the case to the American people of what the threat is, what the stakes are, and what the solutions to the problems are, and what those costs are. If you're going to be able to sustain the budget that will be required to meet these requirements, you're going to have the support of the American people. And that means you need to take the case to the American people. And as a result, our recommendation is very firm that the leadership of this committee and the other people in Congress who have the expertise, such as yourselves, need to take the lead in discussing these important subjects with the people who ultimately have to make the decisions to approve them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I completely agree. I do want to make sure everybody is aware we're going to have votes called in about an hour, so I want us to move quickly. So I will limit myself to one question. I love the report. I am curious, though, and I share your sentiment, Senator, that this committee, as well as our counterpart on the Senate side, is going to have to really be vocal about this. Do y'all have a plan to get in front of Secretary Austin, DepSec Hicks, Chairman Brown, and NSA Director Sullivan with your results so that the administration can be exposed to what your unanimous recommendations are?
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. So we don't yet. We have requested. Obviously, they're a little bit busy these days.
We all are. But
yeah,
this is very, very important.
It is. We did have the opportunity before we released the report to pre-brief the NSC, the Nuclear Weapons Council, and NNSA, and subsequent to the release of the report, we were able to brief the commander of U.S. Strategic Command. So we are making progress, and I hope that we are able to have some more in-depth meetings with both Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary Hicks in the near future.
Excellent. Thank you. I will yield to Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep my questions quick and short as well. You talked about the need to increase investment in conventional forces. This is maybe not what people expected to come out of your report as one of several recommendations. Can you explain why that's important and where that fits into nuclear deterrence?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Moulton, yes. The Commission came to the conclusion that the best way to deter a nuclear conflict is to deter a conventional conflict with nuclear powers, because it is most likely that we would escalate to a nuclear conflict as a result of being in a conventional war with another nuclear power. And that's why we emphasize the need to, first of all, create the deterrent with our conventional forces. And that's where the bulk of the spending, by the way, that we recommend would occur in the early years, building up our conventional forces. Most of the expenditures on the nuclear side would come after that.
So I've been in seen some of these war games where exactly what you described becomes a problem, and a conventional conflict can essentially run out of conventional responses, and so it becomes nuclear. Can you just explain that for the American people, both how a conventional conflict could become nuclear, but also separately how simply having conventional forces could deter conflict in the first place?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Moulton, it's a great question. And the short answer is that if you look at a case like Ukraine, for example, where at a point the Russians were being beaten back and were in a mode of retreat, and there was a lot of speculation at that time that because they didn't have the conventional means to prevent the rout, that they may have to use nuclear weapons, tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons, to cover their rear, in this case, to cover their retreat so that they wouldn't be defeated. And that's just one example of how, in a conventional conflict, a party could conclude that the best way forward for that party is to use the tactical nuclear weapons that they have. Well, it's a pretty short step, and as you know, there's really no clear definition between a strategic and non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapon, but it's a ladder, an escalatory ladder, that you could climb pretty quickly between a lower yield tactical type weapon and using higher yield, almost strategic level weapons. Where this could come into play with the United States, for example, is if there were an attack on a NATO country and we had an obligation to be involved, and the conventional deterrent wasn't adequate to prevent this nuclear escalation, we could find ourselves in that situation relatively quickly. That's what we don't want to do. So if we can have a conventional deterrent that would dissuade any potential adversary from concluding that they could defeat us conventionally, we would have the best chance of also being able to avoid a nuclear conflict.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think we can all agree that we don't want a nuclear conflict, and explaining this is really important because people often ask, why are we investing so much in nuclear weapons? Why are we investing so much in conventional forces in the DoD every year? And ultimately, of course, we all agree that we want to deter war, and specifically, we want to deter nuclear war. I'd also just add very quickly that you were quick to criticize my discussion of prioritization. But you've just described something that we need to invest in, which is separate from our just simply strategic deterrent. If we only had one priority, then I would agree with you that we would only invest in nuclear forces. But when I talk about prioritization, it's figuring out this balance. If you say we have to improve our conventional forces, then we have to figure out how much we put into that versus our nuclear forces in the right balance is going to be difficult to find. But that's exactly why we have your commission, and it's been very helpful, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Moulton, might I respond just very briefly? We conclude that the strategic deterrent is not just a nuclear deterrent. It is a combination of conventional and nuclear. And so when I say that we shouldn't have to prioritize to build our strategic deterrent, what I'm really saying is that we shouldn't have to choose between conventional and nuclear. They are one in the same effort to provide a deterrent against any enemy attack. So if you view the conventional side of the equation as part of the strategic deterrent, we shouldn't have to make those tough choices between one or the other. We can do both.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And the chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for being here today and how important it is. And I think it's really important, too, to see that there's such bipartisan support for your recommendations and what should be done for deterrence. Chairwoman Creedon, with that, I appreciate that the communities of South Carolina and Georgia are extremely supportive of the plutonium pit production mission at the Savannah River site in South Carolina. I am grateful that I'm the only member of Congress who's actually worked at the Savannah River site, so I have a special appreciation. Maintaining enacted levels of funding for the Savannah River plutonium processing facility is necessary to ensure that our nation can reach our nuclear modernization needs and maintain an effective nuclear deterrent. In describing the pit production challenge, the previous administration's nuclear posture review stated that failing to achieve a production capacity of 80 pits per year by 2030, quote, would result in the need for a higher rate of pit production at a higher cost, end of quote. The Commission recommends Congress fund the full range of NNSA's recapitalization efforts such as pit productions and all operations related to critical materials. What can Congress do to help meet the goal of producing plutonium pits at Savannah River site as close to 2030 as possible?
Thank you very much for that question. It is important, and as you mentioned, the infrastructure at the National Nuclear Security Administration needs a considerable amount of work. There is a lot of work that has been done on the science side, and that's important, and it has to continue to allow us to continue to develop and modify as necessary new nuclear weapons. But the actual production infrastructure, as you mentioned, is the one that needs the most attention. So for your question, among other things, I think the NNSA, obviously they need the money to do these things. They need the money on a regularized basis. They need enough money so that they can implement on a practical basis. In other words, as you know, the NNSA is incrementally funded, but having more money in the right years so that they can plan and execute appropriately is important. And I have to mention it, not having CRs is also important, so that they have assured funding coming in. The other thing is people. There's a significant shortage of the right people to do all these things, not only as we think of the scientists and the engineers, but also in the crafts, electricians, welders, everything down the road. So they need support, they need money, and they need people.
And I'm grateful that the Technical College Systems of South Carolina are addressing the critical needs of employees. And Senator Kyle, your report recommends the U.S., quote, urgently deploy a more resilient space architecture and adopt a strategy that includes both offensive and defensive elements to ensure U.S. access to and operations in space, end of quote. You just happen to have hit on a topic that we have a visionary chairman, Mike Rogers, who has been saying this for since the time of Abraham Lincoln. And so with that put in place, can you talk more about the need for this and why an approach that focuses on defense and resilience must include a space domain?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Wilson. The threat briefings that we received leave no question that both China and Russia, but particularly China, see space as a warfighting domain, and both of them view the United States' current array of satellites and reliance upon those satellites as the soft underbelly of the United States posture. So they are very aggressively pursuing both defense and offensive weapons to deal with our space capabilities. The United States has to respond to that. In addition to that, we know that space can be the place where our other assets can be magnified in capability. For example, missile defense for the homeland to deal with a coercive kind of attack might be best dealt with by the array of space assets that we can bring to bear upon that kind of an attack. And one of our recommendations is that the Defense Department explore that, and if it's feasible, to develop a system, both offense and defense, which could deal with a coercive attack. There is no question that in the next conflict, if there be one, space will be a critical aspect of that conflict.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. And Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, I'd like to request permission to enter into a record an op-ed by the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. There's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Without objection. Thank you. We often hear that the term strategic. I know that we on this committee often think of capabilities, particularly our nuclear assets and their global impact. But another definition of strategic comes to mind for me, the idea of a grand strategy or aligning potentially unlimited aspirations with necessarily limited capabilities. I know that we're going to have to make hard decisions to ensure that we provide reasonable oversight, avoid unchecked and rampant spending on wasteful or unnecessary programs, and also to ensure that our spending truly provides for our national defense. So I want to thank the committee for its work, and I'm grateful for your highlighting arms control and international partnerships in your report. I'm also worried that our strategic posture is missing strategic or strategy. We all know that we face competition from Russia and China. We also know there's a growing risk of confrontation and that we do need to find ways to de-escalate. For example, how often do we allocate our resources to have the most efficient way to achieve peace and stability? My questions today really go to this report and how you set it up to win a war, but instead, how do we prioritize our efforts to prevent a conflict from ever emerging? How do we achieve that? You argue that because of the rising threats, the United States and its allies and partners must be ready to deter and defeat both our adversaries. You said China and Russia. My question is, what would it mean to defeat them? Is it a nuclear war against two nuclear-armed adversaries that somehow we could defeat them and win? I think not. But my question to both of you, is it necessary to defeat our competitors to provide security for the American people? For example, wouldn't arms control and de-escalation be preferable to a new arms race? My question.
So thank you very much, Representative Garamendi. So of course the answer is yes to your last question. It would be better to have effective strategic arms control that was both trilateral and that was consistently applied and consistently complied with. So obviously that is appropriate. But right now we are actually facing a situation where we may not have any strategic arms control agreements in place. And this is a very different world. We have both Russia and China are on the cusp of really having a three-peer competitor environment. So we need to have a strategy that deters. To be effective, deterrence must be credible, it must be believable, and not only, as I mentioned, not only to our adversaries, but also to our allies. And our allies have to be part of this, because together we are all much stronger if we are integrated in this. But when you talk about strategy, part of the strategy is to deter conflict in the first place. And to deter conflict in the first place, that deterrence has to be credible. And to be credible, that an adversary has to believe that if they start a conflict,
So
we have to be able to defeat them.
excuse me for interrupting, but then your argument indicates that our current nuclear systems are not credible? Is that what you're arguing?
No, not at all, sir. Remember, our commission report is very much forward-looking. So we look into the future, 2027 and beyond, and we see a threat trajectory that's going in a certain direction. Assuming that threat trajectory continues, we have to make some changes in our strategy. And it's those changes, primarily conventional, some nuclear, but primarily conventional, are going to be needed. Tankers is a good example, to keep us out of that conflict to begin with. And we have to worry about not only one conflict, we have to worry about two conflicts, either sequential or simultaneous. It's a new environment. We have to be prepared for this and plan to be prepared for this.
Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I subscribe to the comments that Madeline has just made to you. Obviously, deterrence is in the mind of the person you're trying to deter, and they have to believe that you're serious enough about trying to prevent conflict that you'll do whatever is necessary to defeat them should they be tempted to try to attack you. And therefore, we have to have the kind of forces in place, both conventional and nuclear, that provide that kind of deterrent.
Gentleman's time's expired. I will admit into the record the opinion piece by Senator Feinstein that he requested. With that, we will move to Mr. Lamborn from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you both for your contributions to our country. For either of you, I applaud the Commission's recommendation that the U.S. must field sufficient conventional forces to effectively deter and defeat simultaneous Russian and Chinese aggression in Europe and Asia. Hypersonic weapons are said to be a conventional weapon with strategic implications. Our two biggest adversaries are well ahead of us in developing offensive hypersonic weapons for which we have very little defense, by the way. Can you elaborate on the deterrent value of offensive hypersonic weapons against coercive attacks by our adversaries?
Thank you very much for that question. So we looked at a range of conventional capabilities that we need to develop. Among them is the hypersonic systems. But it isn't just the hypersonic systems. This is one of the things that we need as a nation to get much better at, and it's incorporating new technologies, including hypersonics. And as we think about new technologies and think about how to deploy new technologies, we also need to think about our industrial base and how to get new players into this. If we're going to be truly innovative, we have to figure out ways to be able to bring these new innovators, the smaller companies, the smaller businesses, the ones who are really thinking about how to do things more effectively, how to do things in a less expensive way, how to take greater advantage of the capabilities that we have. And the hypersonics are simply one of them. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'll add that this is one of the areas in which we focused on defense, because clearly the possibility of an attack coming from one of these hypersonic weapons would be a preemptive or out-of-the-blue kind of an attack. It could be decapitating, and therefore retaliation is not the only or the best solution to it. Therefore, one of our recommendations is to strongly try to improve our air and missile defense systems, both against hypersonic weapons, cruise missiles, improved ballistic missiles. The Russians have devised a whole new suite of platforms with which to deliver their nuclear weapons. And this is why we stress the need for more research and development of defensive capability against these new weapons.
Very good, thank you. For either one of you, Russia and China are increasingly working together to accomplish strategic goals. Did the Commission contemplate the possibility that Russia and China could coordinate their nuclear threats in such a way that the numbers we adhere to under New START are inadequate?
So we certainly spent a lot of time looking at the possibility of collusion between Russia and China. It's one of the reasons that we made the recommendation that we did, that we have to look at a two-war strategy, and that two-war strategy could be simultaneous or it could be conventional. So whether there is overt collusion in some sort of an aggressive behavior, we did feel strongly that the possibility of opportunistic aggression was also really there. But it's really more, I think, on the conventional side. Although we do have to look broadly at our nuclear capabilities vis-a-vis two nuclear peers. So it's one of the reasons why the report concluded that China is no longer a lesser included case in how we think about our planning and doctrine. Thank you.
Senator Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the key here is that we don't need to decide whether an attack is necessarily going to be coordinated between these two adversaries. It's enough that it's opportunistic. In other words, we're in a conflict with one and the other sees that this is an opportunity for us to do what we've always wanted to do, and the United States is otherwise occupied, so we'll try our aggression. Either way, we have to be prepared to deal with both of them simultaneously. And that's why we're going to have some new challenges to deal with this entirely new environment from that which we previously planned, which only dealt with the Russian nuclear side of the equation.
You were there when the Senate passed New START treaty. Are those numbers adequate now that China is in the picture?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative, that's the real question. Our current program of record for our nuclear enterprise is sized to the Russian threat. And under the New START treaty, both sides had the requisite forces that we thought were necessary. You're now adding another component, and the Chinese goal is to have parity with both Russia and the United States. Obviously, that adds a new challenge that we've got to plan for. And our report in several different places notes the fact that whether this is increased size of our weaponry or composition or how we deploy them or all of the above, all of that has to be considered in deciding exactly what our new force structure has to
Gentleman's
look
time
like.
expired. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. Had a previous meeting that had to be at until 10. Two areas of questions. One, in terms of the resiliency and survivability, regardless of how many nuclear weapons or what platforms they are, our command and control structures and the ability to make them less vulnerable. I'm talking about space, command and control, you know, the vulnerability of an attack that could like render our ability to operate, you know, regardless of how many weapons we have, to eliminate that. What's most important for us to do to make sure that those systems can be protected so that our infrastructure can work in a crisis?
Thank you very much, because that is an important area. It's also an area that doesn't get talked about much, you know, notably because so much is classified. But we did recommend that a lot of focus and attention be placed on the modernization of the nuclear command and control system. And this also includes how to make all of these various systems more resilient. So with a space system, maybe it's multiple systems, maybe it's protecting those systems. But part of it is also the early warning part of the nuclear command and control system, and making sure that that doesn't look like a very large target at the outset so that we lose our eyes, if you will. So looking at how to keep early warning systems very accurate, very resilient is a large part of this. The other piece of making sure that the president always has time and options to consider, and the nuclear command and control system has to be the system that provides him that time. So it's incredibly important, and we have to really focus this, and it's hard because it's hard to talk about.
Yeah, understood. The big thing that was missing from this report, in my view, was an analysis of the cost involved. And that's really what we are facing on this committee, because every major system that we're talking about upgrading right now is significantly above budget, whether it's the Sentinel GBSD, I guess the B-21's kind of hanging in there, but there are a variety of different systems. Looking at pit production, it is overwhelming. And when you lay out all of those options, do you have any ideas for us where, okay, here is a more cost-effective way to make sure that we have an adequate deterrent? And obviously, and I said this in my written opening statement, you know, the ground-based system, that is a heck of a lot of money to stick things in a fixed place in the ground that are incredibly vulnerable and have all manner of different problems. Now, in an ideal world, would you like to have it all? Sure, all right? But if you have to make choices in terms of the budget, keeping in mind the questions we've already heard about conventional needs that are there as well, the commission really didn't look at it and say, gosh, you know, for $100 billion less, we could do this, we'd meet our needs, and that would really free up money elsewhere. Is there anything you could say to us about that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Smith, we spent a lot of time considering that question. Of course, our writ did not include the development of cost estimates for all of these things, and we did not do that, as you point out. But just to give you one illustration of the kind of question that we tried to answer here, the ground-based interceptor system that we have today, and I'm not sure if that's what you were referring to by our ground-based missiles, but our current—
I was referring to the ICBM replacement.
Well, if I could just stay on the ground-based defensive system, because to some extent they're related. This is primarily to deter North Korea today, and it makes sense because the kind of system that we have is adequate today to deter North Korea. North Korea is not standing still, however. We recognize that over time we're going to have better and more capable GBI kind of systems to deal with North Korea. The question is, do we just continue up that ladder, or might there be a more cost-effective way to deal with that threat? Certainly, if you're dealing with a coercive threat from China or Russia, you're going to have a more cost-effective way to do that. And that's why we say, with regard to the GBI kind of program, it may have a limit, and we may need to turn to more of a space-based component, which has much greater potential capability against the larger kind of threat, especially coming from Russia or China. And with the technological developments today in reducing launch costs and other expenses in putting satellites in space, we think the time might well have come that this is the place where we could invest more money economically to deal with the problem rather than just continuing to build our GBI system up.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Kyle, Ms. Creed, and thank you all so much for your work on the commission, and thanks for the commission's report. I want to go to one section of the commission report that speaks about the development and deployment of theater-based nuclear systems. And the report describes that this system should exhibit the ability to be forward deployable, survivable against a preemptive attack, has a low yield option, is prompt and can penetrate very sophisticated air and missile defense systems. And I'm only aware of one system that is deployable in the near term, is cost effective, and is there before us today. And it's the nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile, better known as SLICM-N. And I know your report doesn't advocate for a particular platform, but is it your view that the development of a SLICM-N capability would help us address the deterrence challenges that you so eloquently point out in your report?
So thank you very much. So we spent, as you might imagine, we spent a lot of time discussing theater nuclear systems. And we also spent a lot of time looking at the threat, particularly in the Asia Pacific, and also the capabilities that we do have already, the B-61s in Europe. And when we looked at that, and we looked at the threat trajectories, there were a number of things that we itemized that would be potential capabilities, potential characteristics, as you highlight. They're mostly laid out on pages 47 and 48. And so we go through these characteristics, these capabilities that we want. We intentionally did not pick winners and losers on any given system, but that said, I mean, I think there was agreement, however one felt about the SLICM-N, that the SLICM-N certainly would address some of these capabilities. But I just want to reiterate that the Commission itself did not intentionally pick specific winners or losers, mostly because we were so forward-looking in our report. We want the Defense Department to determine what they really need.
Gotcha. Very good. Senator Kyle?
Yes, the answer to your question is yes, SLICM-N would achieve the objective that we set out. Whether there are other systems that would be left to the decision makers in the future, including all of you.
From your perspective, how important is time in this? I think what we're seeing is an accelerated effort by China across the nuclear spectrum in the threat that is developing at orders of magnitude against the United States. How important is time in this deterrent effect on a low-yield option as a deterrent to China?
Mr. Chairman, if I could just speak generally rather than to this specific requirement, you put your finger on probably the key point here. We don't have any more time. Yeah. As one of the witnesses said, we've used up all of our workarounds. And the schedules, both for the refurbishment of the nuclear warheads and the development of the new platforms, is a tight schedule. And while the operatives say that they're going to do their best to meet the schedules, the reality is we've found delays here and there, and it's very difficult to imagine that we could meet the schedule. As a result, there are a couple of charts in our report which show the potential for a deterrence gap, which in effect say, here's where we are today. We're going to decline in deterrence because certain systems have to be retired. They simply won't work anymore. And by the time we get the new systems online to replace them, we will have spent time in an area without an adequate deterrent. That's the threat that we have, and it's the thing that we most have to try to avoid.
To both of you, is it your view that an 80% solution available in the next 18 to 24 months would be preferable to the 100% solution available in the late 2030s?
So thank you for that question. I think, I mean, I'm going to go back to, there's a lot of analysis that this report lays on the doorstep of the Defense Department, the administration, Congress, and what is actually the right system is part of what the analysis needs to be. So yes, the SLICM-N would have the advantage probably of being sooner, but the actual analysis has yet to be done by the department.
Okay, very good. Senator, any closing thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Whitman, of course, there is no good answer to your question. I just go back to the point I made earlier, which is that if our strategic deterrent is the #1 priority for our military, as our defense secretaries and Joint Chiefs Chairman have all said, and which I think our commission certainly agreed with, then we have a lot of other things which we can prioritize, but this has to be #1 priority. And going back to your previous question, it's not just a matter of what we ultimately develop. We have to be very cognizant of short-run gaps in deterrence, which will result from the fact that we are replacing whole systems in a just-in-time manner, and we may not be just in time.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses here today. I am gravely concerned about nuclear proliferation and sincerely hope my colleagues share that concern. It is in the best interest of all human life to pursue global disarmament. I do understand the need to maintain our triad in order to deter adversaries, but we hope we can strike a balance of effective deterrence with costs and, more importantly, protecting human life. In the report, you mentioned that most commissioners believe it is inevitable that the size of the U.S. nuclear stockpile and the number of delivery systems should increase. Ms. Creedon, in your opinion, at what point does building a bigger stockpile become redundant? Does it matter if we have, let's say, for the sake of this example, 1,000 more or 1,000 less nuclear weapons than our peer adversaries, if we all have enough to wipe out life as we know it?
So thank you very much for that question. And first, I want to very much support your initial comment about nonproliferation. This is a very important aspect of this. This is nonproliferation, proliferation prevention is very much the flip side of deterrence. And one of the things that we did mention briefly in this is that even though we are looking at a world without a bilateral arms control treaty for the first time in a very long time, we do have to continue to work and be prepared for the time when we have the ability, hopefully, possibly, to get another arms control agreement in place, assuming it's in our U.S. national interest, to make sure that if there is one, it's viable, it's verifiable, and we have the technologies to be able to do all the things needed in a treaty. The research and development that goes on at the National Nuclear Security Administration is very important, making sure that we are looking at these capabilities now. So again, planning for the future and having these capabilities in the future. But to the rest of your question, numbers are important, but they're not they really are not the full discussion here. And sometimes I think we get a little distracted by the conversation on numbers, because what we really talked about is we could need more, we could need different, we could need both, but it really depends on how the Department of Defense, how the U.S. Strategic Command, how U.S. policy puts in place those things that the nuclear weapons need to hold at risk. And that's the discussion, again, that has to happen. So when I said we left a lot of analysis at the door of DOD's doorstep, we did. And this is part of it. How many do we need, and what do we need them for?
Thank you. Talking about numbers further, Senator Kyle, we don't have an endless budget, and the cost of these modernization programs continue to grow, and schedules are delayed further and further. Interestingly, the report did not include any cost estimates because I guess they shouldn't matter. Do you think including information regarding the cost of these programs would have better informed Congress? And if you had included a cost analysis, would it have impacted any of your recommendations?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, I don't think it would have changed any of our recommendations, to answer your last question. In our writ, there's a statutory writ that we were given, and we were not asked to provide cost estimates. But I mean, you could consider that a bit of a cop-out, but the reality is it'd be very hard for us to do that in any event. And the reason is because a lot of the things that have to be decided, as Madeline pointed out, are to be decided in the future based upon the situation that exists at the time. What we primarily say here is we have to make decisions now to make sure that we have the capacity to build whatever we're going to need to build. We're not sure right now what all of that is. But if we don't make decisions now to enable us to have the capacity, then when we finally do decide, it's going to be too late if we haven't provided for sufficient capacity. And that's why we say that has to be decided now. Just is about $75 billion a year. It's about 7.5% of the defense budget. That's a very small amount of a budget which today is about 3% of overall GDP of the United States, as compared to twice that much during the 1980s. So our current program of record, I think it's pretty hard to criticize as being too costly. And what has to be spent beyond that will have to be determined by you in later years to reach the capabilities that we say are necessary and that we recommend in our report.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here today. In your recommendations, the Commission cites the need to prioritize funding and accelerate long-range, non-nuclear precision strike programs to meet the operational need and in greater quantities than currently planned. Senator Kyle, you stated in your Senate testimony that the first thing, and I'm quoting, the first thing we've got to do is have a conventional capability, which is so dominant that no party would ever consider a nuclear attack against the United States. In your opinion, are U.S. stockpiles of long-range precision fires, in your estimation, currently inadequate to contend with adversary capabilities in the security environment we face?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Gallagher, I think that's one of the recommendations we make, that one of the shortages that we've got to deal with is precisely this shortage, to have the conventional capability to deter an adversary. So the answer is yes, it's inadequate today.
So just to put a finer point on it, when it comes to long-range precision fires, particularly long-range anti-ship missile, JASM, JADM, you would agree that it's absolutely essential and has key impacts on our nuclear security to surge production and stockpile key long-range precision fires?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gallagher, we don't specifically talk about surging production or stockpiling, but the answer to your question is yes.
Thank you. Help me, and I don't know who's best to answer this question. One thing I'm struggling with is to understand the scale of the PLA's, not just conventional buildup, but its nuclear buildup in particular, in a way that makes sense, with some frame of reference. Could you help me sort of, in a way that I could communicate to my constituents, that would make them care about it and communicate why it matters, sort of put what we're seeing in China in the appropriate context, historical or otherwise?
Well, thank you. So in our report, in the threat section of our report, we detail the rapid growth on both conventional and nuclear systems that the intelligence community has seen in China.
Yeah.
Also looking at some of the stated goals that President Xi has announced, and other activities that are going on, not only on the land-based conventional, but they're developing a real triad on the nuclear side. They're rapidly developing space capabilities. So if you look forward, and that's what our whole report is trying to do, look forward in the 2027 and beyond, somewhere in the 30s, if they keep on their current trajectory, maybe a little bit sooner, we're looking at a true peer, both on a nuclear and a conventional perspective. And this is an area that we've never been in before, where we have two nuclear peers. And also a regional power in China who's looking to be a global power to really challenge the U.S.'s global leadership and break up our alliances. So it's a very different world, but hopefully in our report we captured a little bit of the essence of this threat and why it's so concerning.
Would it overstate the case to say that their nuclear and conventional buildup, I guess just focus on the nuclear, is unprecedented or unprecedented in modern times?
So certainly the rate at which they're building up has been very surprising. and I should probably leave it at that.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gallo, the only thing I'd add to that is that one of the witnesses came before us and said, one thing about the Chinese is that they're always ahead of schedule. Whenever they say they're going to achieve a certain system by a certain time, they beat that schedule. So I think Madeline is exactly right in characterizing it the way she did.
Is there anything about, and forgive me, I do conventional, not strategic, their nuclear doctrine, in the way that we tend to sort of obsess over Russia's escalate to de-escalate, is there anything in particular we should know about the PLA's nuclear doctrine that you think is important for us to understand? Microphone, please.
So they do have a lot of writings that we should certainly pay attention to. But one of our recommendations, sort of buried deep in the report, is that we need more capabilities within our intelligence community, within our policy community, to really understand how their both conventional and nuclear policy doctrines are evolving. So we need to put a lot of focus and attention in building these capabilities so we understand just that.
My time has expired. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Jacobs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here today. You know, I think it's important we consider the implications of expanding our nuclear arsenal, as the report suggests. And, you know, I know we've talked a little bit about how that could be contributing to a global arms race, and if so, what are the consequences of this? Given recent GAO reporting on DoD weapons acquisition programs and NNSA infrastructure efforts, it's kind of difficult to find a bright spot in the modernization of strategic forces. All indications point to substantial schedule slippages and cost overruns. And Senator Kyle, I know you said that it's our responsibility to educate the American people about the situation. But, you know, I wanted to follow up on my colleague, Mr. Carvajal's question. The Commission seems to make very significant investments that would cost several billions of dollars in this environment and with competing national and international concerns. How do you reconcile the recommendations of the report with budget constraints generally?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Jacobs, no, we did not attempt to develop a cost estimate because most of our recommendations relate to capabilities rather than specific systems, so we can't do that yet.
Sure. I understand that you can't give us a cost estimate, but everything in the report is going to cost a lot of money. So did you take the constraint of generally the fact that it's not an unlimited budget into account when you were working on the report?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Jacobs, we took into account the fact that our military leaders have said routinely that this strategic deterrent is the #1 priority for them. And if that is the case, then we decided we would recommend what we felt was necessary and leave it up to you and the presidents, the executive branch, to determine precisely what the programs are and how they're to be funded.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask, you know, you mentioned in your testimony that this was a consensus report that all the commissioners signed on. Could you talk about what some of the points of contention were in the debate or where there were disagreements?
Well, thank you very much. But as you might imagine, we had lots of robust discussions, and we wrestled with every word in this report. That's why it is a consensus report. But in the end, because of our commitment to consensus, we were able to get there, and everybody wanted to get there. But on the specifics, no, that's within the four corners of our robust debate and discussion.
Got it. Thank you. And lastly, you know, the U.S. land-based ICBM fields are often referred to as a sponge to soak up an opponent's nuclear forces. If that's the case, can you talk about why you think it's important that we modernize that arm of the triad? As long as we have enough Minuteman missiles and silos, why do we need to spend so much more money on the Sentinel program?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Jacobs, the fact is that our current system has deteriorated and aged to the point that we wouldn't be confident in the deterrent value of it on out into the future. When you see the photographs of these silos that house one of the most sophisticated weapons ever devised by man, you wonder. The walls are bulging, there's rust, there are wires that are no longer functioning properly. These silos have to be refurbished and new missiles put in them because the current system is rapidly aging out.
Sure, I understand that. If the purpose was to use them as a deterrent, to use them, but the idea is that the land-based part of the triad, being referred to as the sponge, is mostly so that our opponents would use their weapons to attack those instead of the other parts of our triad.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Jacobs, the whole point is if the adversary believes that our system no longer functions, then they don't need to try to wipe it out at the beginning of a conflict. They have to believe that this is a fully functioning and very dynamic and vibrant system in order to be deterred.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing your experience to bear to advise us on how to maintain the strategic deterrent. I focus a lot on hypersonics here, and so I was wondering what your perspective was on how our current hypersonic capabilities compared with these two near-peer adversaries was contributing to that sense of deterrence.
Well, sort of simply put, we're a little behind in terms of the development of our hypersonics capabilities. There are clearly some extraordinary programs. The other piece of the hypersonics that we should also look at is some of the new systems of China. One of the systems that we talk about in our report is the FOB, the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, and that's one of the areas where we also have introduced the concept of some possible arms control. That's a suggestion for that, or for confidence-building measures along those lines.
I just don't know in sort of a normative geopolitical atmosphere whether or not arms control is all that likely on hypersonics when, as you say, we're behind, our adversaries are ahead. It seems as though they might not have an incentive to engage in that arms control. Senator, you've got vast experience on these issues. What does it mean that the United States of America is behind in hypersonics relative to our adversaries? How does that impact decision-making?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Gates. What it shows, first of all, it's kind of the microcosm for the macrocosm. We went to sleep for several years after the Cold War. The peace dividend is here. We don't need to worry about these things anymore. Well, not everybody went to sleep, and the Chinese and the Russians both have developed some very sophisticated systems that we did not work on until very recently. So Madeline is right. We're behind, both countries, with regard to the hypersonic issue. We've had tests, and I won't get into the details, but the bottom line is that we are behind where our two opponents are. And what this means is that they have some capabilities with which they can threaten us. It isn't necessarily the case that we have to catch up with their offensive capability. Perhaps with defensive capabilities, we can parry this thrust in effect. A good missile defense program, for example, might be at least part of a deterrent to deal with these weapons, at least until the United States is able to catch up offensively. But it makes our planning much more difficult.
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction between the offensive and defensive capabilities, but in a world in which China and Russia can hit a moving target with hypersonic delivery systems, and we can't hit a moving target with hypersonic delivery systems, I'm worried that that impacts a lot of the strategic decision-making that we've been discussing today. And just to draw a finer point on it, Senator, when you say we are behind both countries in hypersonics, you are referring to China and Russia, right?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gates, that's correct.
It's remarkable because you all have great experience. You look at these things, you have no ulterior motives. But when we bring DOD personnel in, they're real sheepish on that. We can't get those clear admissions that we're behind to inform how we fund these things. Instead, they talk about the next upcoming test, but increasingly the Army has failed time and again to have these tests in a position to field our hypersonic systems. Like, what level of trust do you have that the Army's going to get this right?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative Gates, I'm not going to answer that question because I don't know. Our responsibility is to be straightforward with you all. You're the ones that appointed us. You're the ones that we answer to. very hard, I think, a lot of times for military people to explain everything and answer to questions from you all. You understand the reasons why. One of the things that we noticed in this endeavor is there is a great attitude among the military, among the Defense Department generally, in being able to succeed at a mission. It's a great thing about Americans. You give us a job to do and we'll try to figure out a way to do it. The problem with that is that sometimes it can appear to be a little unrealistic. And what we are concerned about is that in a multitude of areas here, the attitude of, well, somehow or other we'll get there, isn't necessarily the best information for
No, I
members
got you.
of Congress
I
to
get that the scientific method includes testing hypotheses and they don't always work out, but I just don't think we should view it as unrealistic that we should be able to have like the capability, the basic capabilities on hypersonics that our adversaries do, particularly the ability to hit a moving target. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I would like to make the announcement that you've heard the bells ring and votes have been called. Our witnesses have another meeting at noon, so we will not be able to come back after votes because votes won't end till noon. So we will do Mr. Horsford for questions, and then Mr. Bacon, and then we will adjourn. So, Mr. Horsford, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member for this important hearing. My district in Nevada includes the Nevada National Security Site, an enterprise of multi-mission, high-hazard experimentation facilities delivering technical and service solutions in support of our nation's national security. The world-class work that's being done at NNSS would not be possible without the hardworking individuals who come from all over the state of Nevada. The primary mission of NNSS is to help ensure the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile remains safe, reliable, secure from our adversaries, and host all three NNSA laboratories. Chair Creedon, given your previous positions at NNSA, can you talk about the importance of the facilities across development, production, sustainment, and dismantlement in ensuring that the U.S. maintains a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. The National Nuclear Security Site at Nevada, the Nevada Test Site as we often refer to it historically, is really where so much of the experimental work at NNSA is done. So one of the key new projects that's underway right now is called ECSE. It's the Expanded Capabilities for Subcritical Experiments, and that doesn't really say much on its face. But what this does is this is a whole laboratory underground with an accelerator to help the United States more fully understand the functioning of nuclear weapons so that we can not only maintain them, but that we understand them so that we can do more things in the future, whether that's pit reuse, whether it's developing new pits based on the heritage of the tests at Nevada. It's the whole ramification. So much work is done out there. There's also, and I mentioned earlier, some of the verification work that NNSA also does. There's a tremendous amount of that work out there. They just recently conducted an experiment with conventional high explosives to try and improve the capability for detection of others who might be trying to conduct nuclear tests underground. You know, there's a threshold beyond which it's quite difficult to detect. And it's also a host for a number of other government agencies who can bring their experiments to Nevada because of the size, the space, the complexity, and frankly, the workforce. But like all the sites, Nevada also has a challenge with respect to the workforce. It's, as you know, it's a very remote site. It takes a long time to get out there. So really focusing on the workforce out there is also hugely important.
I was just speaking to a group of workers over the weekend, in fact, based on a contract issue that we're trying to get addressed, so I agree. What findings and recommendations specific to sites such as NNSS did the Commission make to address any current shortfalls and/or improve management going forward?
So what we looked at primarily was, as I mentioned, the state of the infrastructure. Nevada it's huge. I mean, the Nevada site is huge. I don't think it's often recognized how big it really is. So it has hundreds of miles of roads and that need maintaining. In many respects, it's a small state. And so the infrastructure out there, both the experimental infrastructure, all of the workforce, all of this needs it needs to be updated. It needs to be maintained. One of the things that we talk about with respect to the infrastructure is on the NNSA side, other than some of the scientific infrastructure, like some of the work that was done historically on the subcriticals experiments, we didn't do much in terms for quite a while, and so now we're kind of playing catch up on this infrastructure, and so it's important that this get funded and that it get funded consistently, as I mentioned, without CRs, hopefully, and that there are adequate funds to do the planning and people to implement it. But it's a big infrastructure problems. We talk about maintaining infrastructure in perpetuity so that we don't take these breaks in the past where we lost the ability to do things.
Thank you for underscoring the points on infrastructure and funding, sustainable funding. Thank you both for your service, and I yield back my time.
Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate you all being here today. I was stationed at Davis-Monthan and Tucson, so I had a great senator and Senator Kyle. And I see General Chambers, who I worked with when I was a colonel at Ramstein, a great fan. So I appreciate your recommendations. I support modernizing the triad, obviously. The one area that I'm concerned is with nuclear C3, and in particular with the newer weapons that reduce our warning times with current technology to 15 minutes, future technology to no warning times. I think we need to go back to where we used to have 24/7 airborne backup capabilities for our command and control, the looking glass. We did it for 29 years, and we stopped in 1990. What's your all's position on that? I think we need to have an emergency 24/7 backup capability that can't be taken out by surprise, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Representative Bacon, one of our recommendations concerns ways that we could potentially mitigate the risk of a deterrence gap and prepare for a future situation where we're in the process of transitioning from the legacy systems to the modernized systems. And that would include, for example, different policies with respect to the alert status of our bomber force. There are specific recommendations in the report that go directly to that. There are some other related recommendations, but I think that's the specific one that you're talking about.
You're talking about the bombers, and I would agree with you. I think we need a command and control survivability analysis here, because with minimal warning times, the White House, the Pentagon, STRATCOM could be hit, and then you're headless. And we got to find ways to have survivability.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bacon, you're exactly right. One of our commissioners, retired General John Hyten, was the STRATCOM commander, and he was a great asset for the committee to understand exactly what you're talking about. He accompanied us when we went out to STRATCOM in Omaha, and or Bellevue, I guess, to be precise. And a large part of our conversation there dealt with how we could make sure that our command and control kept up with the developments that are occurring, just as you point out. So our recommendation for our nuclear enterprise is for the personnel, the enterprise, for the facilities, for the nuclear warheads themselves, and for the command and control. All of those are part of the existing program of record, which must be completed.
They've tried to present to me, too, how they feel it's survivable. I have not been convinced. I used to fly on the Looking Glass, too, when I was a one-star. With 15-minute warning times going to 0 in the future, I just think we got to have some kind of, it's not for us, so the Russians and the Chinese know they can't catch us by surprise. I just would like to push this further. How do we assure that even with 0 warning time, we have command authorities not at the positions that are targeted? We got to find a way to do that, and I'm going to be pushing this until we get resolution within DOD. And I really appreciate, I support all your findings. I just think I'd like to add one and build on it. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I thank the witnesses. This is a great report. I would ask that a copy of the full report be put into the record, and I would let you know that I'm sure that given that we had to abbreviate this because of votes, there's going to be some questions for the record that I would ask that you respond to. And with that, thank you, and we are adjourned.